and died of his injuries several days later. In a letter written by Dr. Joseph Garland on October 14, 1886, he certified that Langsford died as a result of the injury. 23 inches of the sword had run through the dory, 7 inches of it in Langsford. The sword and letter were sent to the National Museum in Washington, D.C. Franklin D. Langsford was not married, he had no children, and he is buried in Locust Grove Cemetery. Ebenezer Dooley and Judith Langsford and 4 of their children are buried in Langsford Cemetery. One of their sons, George, died 7 days after birth, while their daughter, Lucy, died at the age of 28. And from the Cape Ann Light and Gloucester Telegraph, on November 7, 1863, a serious accident at Lanesville was reported by Mr. Levi Denon of the Lanesville Coach. George Sargent and Evan Dooley Jr., both 15, were injured when a gun in their boat accidentally discharged after a day of gunning out in the bay. The shot passed through George's arm and struck Evan over the left eye, passing through his scalp. George is reported to have lost the use of his arm, while Evan died of his injuries several days later. Evan Jr. is buried in the Dooley family lot in Langsford Cemetery. The poor Dooleys, I'm telling you, there's a lot of bad stuff. Evan's younger brother, Oscar Dooley, was 10 years old in 1864. That's a year after, well, not quite a year, but a year after his brother. When he was 7 years old, when he and 7-year-old Thomas Whalen were bathing in a pond just beyond the meeting house. Oscar tried to swim across with Whalen on his back. Both boys sank before they could be rescued and were found hours later. The Dooley brothers are buried side by side, and Whalen is also buried in Langsford Cemetery. In that same pond, 30 years later, David Philbrook's son, George, 7, drowned while fishing on the west side with his friend. George slipped in the 28-foot deep pond owned by the Lanesville Granite Company. You really have to feel sympathy for the Dooleys.
Yeah.
When Judith was 5 years old, she lost her father, John Lane Langsford, when he fell overboard while fishing off Jeffrey's Ledge in 1823. Evan Dooley, the husband, had tragically lost his wife Judith in 1858 and 3 of their children. And then he died in 1865, leaving 2 children, John Lewis and Bertha. On the other hand, there are less tragic stories among the branches of the Dooley family. In this book, here are the Dooleys. As you've heard, Lanesville was definitely not immune to tragedies. John Harridan, age 39, went missing on Saturday, April 23rd, 1853, after taking sick. He was not in his room when his friends went to check on him later that night. John was found Sunday afternoon off the Lanes Cove breakwater after committing suicide. He had been feeling low-spirited and tied a rope and a 20-pound rock around his neck. John H. Harridan was a son of Jonathan Harridan and Jane Lane Harridan and is buried in Cove Hill. Mr. William Young from Lanesville drowned in Salem Harbor on September 1st, 1857. William was seen alone on the deck of a Cape Ann fishing vessel at about 1:30 a.m. He was missing at 3:45 a.m. At 7 a.m., he was recovered from the harbor, burial place unknown. Another tragedy, this one is in February of 1895, when 18-month-old Mary, daughter of Henry Markey, drowned in her bath during the temporary absence of her mother, burial place unknown. Lane's villains have always turned to the sea to feed and support their families. And whoops, back one. There you go. Yeah. In 1865, 1894, and 1913, and still today, their stories tell us of fishermen's catch. Captain Fred T. Lane of the Charles Dyer is said to have landed a 142-pound codfish in 1894. From the Foster photo collection, Howard Bates is pictured with his catch from the bay, and Jacob Grumblad in 1913 is holding up a codfish almost as big as he is. Anyone who grew up in Gloucester knows that when the D-hide was running, while fish was being processed, especially pogies, it stunk. There is no other smell like it. It turns out that Lanesville and Folly Cove had fish kettles. Fish kettles were used to cook down the fish, releasing the oils. It was a long, hot, smelly, and profitable production. Here's a snippet from the Gloucester Telegraph on October 4th, 1865. Menhaden, mackerel, and herring. A big strike of fish on the north side of the Cape last week, and which still continues, promises to replenish the pockets of our fishermen. The fishermen catch as many pogies as they can detach from their nets, and the oil kettles at Lanesville and Folly Cove are kept busy day and night. The men engaged in catching these fish make all the way from $10 to $100 a day, and the oilers are doing a better business. The War of 1812 triangle. A triangle because Andrew Langsford, William Dade, and William Langsford were all buried in like a triangle in Langsford Cemetery, and were involved in the Battle of Folly Cove in 1814. According to Barbara Erkler's account, John, the Village of Lanes Cove, and Veterans Pension Files, Lanesville's connection to the War of 1812 was the Battle of Folly Cove. It was fought in September of 1814 when the British cruisers Leander and La Hogue, and that's actually paintings of the two vessels that we found. They were following a schooner towing lumber headed to Sandy Bay Harbor, but hid in the Folly Cove ledges. I don't know how they hid, because not really much ledges to hide from anybody, unless you're on land. A crew of British Marines commanded by Sir George Collier from one of the cruisers tried to capture the schooner, but was met with musket fire, forcing